Okay, so good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. So it is my pleasure to welcome you at the conference, the neo-Kantian Reception of Schiller. And as you probably know, this conference is the final event of the research project, the neo-Kantian Reception of Schiller between Platonism and neo-Kantianism, led by me as a principal investigator and the head of the research group at the University of Naples, Federico II, and Claudia Locasto as vice principal investigator and head of the research group at the University of Salerno. So unfortunately, Claudia couldn't be here today, but she will be in the next days. So she asked me to bring her apologies for this and also to welcome you on her behalf. I also have to say that we had a few cancellations. So tomorrow, Beatrice Centis talk will not happen. So we will end sooner. And also the last day, Jacinto Paez Bonifaci and Niklas Sommer couldn't be here. And so their talks are also cancelled. So we'll end sooner. More time for you to visit the city. Now, before the conference begins, I would like to take a moment to talk about the scope of the project and its background. So, excuse me for a few autobiographical notes. So, the initial idea for the project was inspired by the work of Friedrich Beiser, whose wonderful book on Schiller concludes with an appendix titled The Neo-Kantian Interpretation of Schiller. So at the time I read Beiser's book because I was beginning my research on Friedrich Albert Lange, who constantly referred to Schiller. And for this reason, I wanted to delve more into Schiller's philosophy. And as I always do, I always start with Beiser's book or this sort of goals. And Beiser's book not only provided me with this initial access to Schiller's philosophy, but also drew my attention to the importance of the neo-Kantian reception of Schiller. So as I continued my research on Lange and Schiller, I noticed that apart from Beiser's book and a few other mentions, literature on this important topic was really lacking. So I felt that such an obvious gap in scholarship required a broader research project to address it. And since we already had a group of scholars working on neo-Kantianism here in Naples, we had the necessary expertise to conduct this research. However, since the interpretations of Schiller's philosophy tend to juxtapose the Kantian elements against the presence of Platonic themes in his philosophy, I thought it would have been interesting to include in the research an analysis of the Platonic and Neoplatonic aspects of Schiller's philosophy as well. And this for two reasons. First, the fact that even the connection between Schiller and Platonism has not been widely studied, except for David Path's book on Platonism in Schiller's Aesthetics. And second, because analyzing Schiller's Platonism would have allowed us to examine how the neo-Kantian thinkers reacted not only to the obvious Kantian elements within Schiller's philosophy, but also to the Platonic themes. And for example, I knew that Lange was not shy about the connection between Plato and Schiller, but positively saw the German poet as a sort of modern-day Plato. So the working hypothesis behind the project was that the neo-Kantian interpretation of Schiller's philosophy shouldn't necessarily be regarded as opposed to the Platonic interpretation, nor should imply a downplay of Schiller's Platonism. And therefore, Claudia Locasto, whose area of expertise is precisely Neoplatonism, joined the project, leading the research group in Salerno that was tasked with studying the Platonic and Neoplatonic sources and themes in Schiller's philosophy. And the results of this part of the project were presented at a conference held in Salerno last June and will be published soon in the conference proceedings. So in addition to the two collected editions based on the proceedings of the Salerno conference and this conference, the project expected results also included an Italian translation of three significant works that shaped the reception of Schiller within the neo-Kantian tradition. And these are, first, Kuno Fischer's Schiller als Philosoph, which, as you probably know, was the first work to draw attention to the importance of Schiller as a philosopher. And this book is being translated by Lorenzo Licciardi from the University L'Orientale in Naples, who is also chairing this afternoon's session. Then the second translation is Friedrich Albert Lange's Einleitung und Kommentar zu Schillers philosophischen Gedichten, translated and introduced by me. And if you're interested, you can pick a copy for free here. And finally, Ernest Cassirer's Essays on Schiller, translated and introduced by my colleague at Federico II, Luigi Laino. And so, as this conference marks the culmination of 2 years of research, I would like to thank everyone who worked on the project, both here and in Salerno. And particularly, I would like to thank the researchers recruited for the project, Francesco Pisano in Naples, and Claudia Gianturco and Ilaria Grimaldi in Salerno, who will also join us in the following days. And finally, I would like to thank you all for being here today and for accepting the invitation to participate in the conference and in the proceedings. And I'm really confident that this collection of essays will become the key reference point on the topic of the neo-Kantian reception of Schiller and therefore advance the scholarship both on neo-Kantianism and its internal development, as well as on Schiller and his Wirkungsgeschichte. And last but not least, I would like to give a special thank to our first invited speaker, Professor Friedrich Beiser. So as I already said, this project would not exist without his work and the inspiration. And therefore, I'm very glad and honored that he is here today to open the conference. Of course, there is no need to introduce him because we all know his work, which played a key role in making German philosophy of the long 19th century available to the English-speaking community, and therefore, we may say, to the world. So thank you very much to Professor Beiser, and I will give him the floor.
Oh, this talk, which we're going to do now, is actually taken from a Schiller book which I wrote 20 years ago, and I have to say, I've mostly forgotten. So I had to reread the book, and I've redone much of the material. And what I've written here is particularly for this conference. It's from the. This has less to do with the neo-Kantian interpretation of Schiller, but with the postmodernist interpretation of Schiller. And I've took issue with them in my 2005 book, and I've had no regrets about that. But I've gone back and re-explored the thing, and what I have here is the result of that re-exposition. I think I'm going to cut this paper a little bit short. I don't want to bore you. So it's not very long. I read it at home, and it was 20 minutes. But having to speak here, I go much slower. So anyway, we'll see how it goes. Anyway, so here goes. Schiller's major aesthetic writings, his Kallias-Briefe, Anmut und Worte, and the Aesthetische Briefe, have been a source of inspiration and controversy for more than 2 centuries. The essays were written over a very short period, from January 1793 to June 1795, but the 2 years for their composition have been overshadowed by the 2 centuries of their interpretation, which have never reached a conclusion or consensus. How are we to interpret these writings? They have raised the most troublesome questions, some of them very basic. Perhaps the most fraught of all is whether they're the works of philosophy or of literature. Should we read them as technical treatises of philosophy, or perhaps more charitably, as literary manifestos about the requirements for good art? It would seem that the best clue for the interpretation of these writings would be the kind of man who wrote them? Was he a philosopher or a poet? Schiller himself leaves us no doubt about how he would answer this question. He conceived himself, first and foremost, as a poet. In early 1795, while finishing the Aesthetische Briefe, Schiller expressed his longing to return to drama and poetry. He would complain bitterly to Goethe about how trying and artificial philosophy could be. Then, at the end of the year, he finally declared, with a sigh of relief, how it was, quote, high time to close his philosophical shop, unquote. And so, in early 1796, Schiller happily returned to poetry and drama, never to return to philosophy. For many scholars, Schiller's self-conception as a poet, his short interlude as a philosopher, is sufficient grounds not to take his aesthetic writings too serious as philosophy. Their artificial structure, their sketchy reasoning, their obscure concepts, their tentative conclusions, all betrayed the poet who wrote them. If we approach Schiller's aesthetic writings charitably, if we consider the kind of man who wrote them, then it would seem we have to lay aside the strict standards of philosophy and to treat them according to the kinder and more liberal standards of poetry. These considerations about Schiller the man, about Schiller the committed poet, and the reluctant philosopher have been for many years the chief rationale for the poetic or literary interpretation of the aesthetic writings. The recent postmodern interpretation of these writings has begun from the same starting. The hallmark of the postmodern approach to Schiller's aesthetic writings is its emphasis upon their poetic or rhetorical dimension. According to this approach, the essential purpose and structure behind these writings is poetic, stylistic, and rhetorical, rather than philosophical, logical, and systematic. Because of their rhetorical and poetic language, and because of the author's confession as a poet, we are warned against understanding Schiller as a systematic philosopher or rigorous thinker. The ambiguities, inconsistencies, and vagueness of these writings, we are told, are a product of a philosophical amateur and a self-confessed poet. Insofar as it is based upon Schiller's self-conception as a poet, there is a great blind spot to the postmodernist reading of Schiller. Although Schiller saw himself as a poet, it does not follow that his works were entirely poetic. Not only does this not follow logically, but there are other factors about Schiller the man that would dampen, mitigate, and qualify his poetic identity. The other factor that has to be taken into account, one the postmodernists have entirely, is Schiller's education in the Karlschule. The Karlschule was unique in German education of the period in that its curriculum emphasized philosophy over religion and classics. More than 15 hours a week were devoted to philosophy. Students learned logic, metaphysics, and ethics, and they read modern philosophers, among them Moses Mendelssohn, Ernst Plattner, and Christian Garbe. They also studied, in German translation, the central figures of the Scottish Enlightenment: Adam Smith, Adam Ferguson, Francis Hutcheson, and David Hume. And they read in the French original, the French materialists, Lemaitre, de Holbach, and Helvetius. The lectures introduced them to some of the latest thinking in aesthetics, especially the writings of Herder, Winckelmann, Sulzer, Lessing, and Watteau. The Karlsruhe were encouraged not only to acquire historical knowledge of past thinkers, but they were also trained to think for themselves. Students were given much practice in writing. They had to compose essays, defend theses, and submit dissertations. In effect, this meant that Schiller was educated as a philosopher. Indeed, he became a philosopher before a poet. If we are to regard facts about Schiller the man as the deciding factor in the interpretation of his aesthetic, we are justified in interpreting them philosophically as well as poetically. For Schiller's past shows that he was a philosopher before a poet. There is nothing wrong in principle with a poetic or rhetorical approach to Schiller's aesthetic writings. Schiller's rhetoric is as legitimate an object of interest and investigation as his philosophical theorizing and reasoning. Indeed, some recent work has shed much light on the importance of the rhetorical tradition for Schiller's program of aesthetic education. However, this approach goes astray when it claims priority over or attempts to replace a close philosophical examination of texts. In this case, two problems arise. First, such an approach is flatly contrary to Schiller's intention, to his own conception of his aesthetic writings. And second, it cannot dispense with, but ultimately presupposes a philosophical analysis of the text. Each of these points requires further explanation. Although Schiller saw himself first and foremost as a poet, there can still be no doubt that he regarded his aesthetic writings as attempts at serious philosophy. Under the influence of Kant and Reinhold, Schiller stressed in his aesthetic writings the importance of system, the need for clear conceptual distinctions, and the value of derivation from first principles. While he was not so confident or naive to believe that he had actually attained these goals, he still insisted that it is necessary for every serious thinker to strive to approach them. All the major early aesthetic writings, the Kallias-Briefe, Antwort und Würde, the Städtische Briefe, are efforts to find the first principles of aesthetics and to provide a system for them. While Schiller abandoned his effort in the Kallias-Briefe to provide the first principle of aesthetics, he never abandoned his foundationless program itself. He would make another attempt to provide aesthetics with a systematic foundation in letters 11 to 15 of the Städtische Briefe. So severe was Schiller's demand for clarity, rigor, and system that it led to his sharp censure of some of his more lax philosophical contemporaries, among them Bramdor, Schlosser, and last but not least, Friedrich Schlegel. Since he found their writings vague, uncritical, and shallow, he could not bear to read, publish, or review. When the thinking got tough, Schiller complained, they resorted to metaphors and appeals to feeling. One could not, as he grumbled to Goethe about Schlosser, quote, simply smell and feel one's way through metaphysics. In this context, it is highly instructive to compare Schiller with his romantic progeny, especially Novalis and Friedrich Schlegel. The postmodern reading of Schiller has its source, I would suggest, in a common confusion, the conflation of Schiller with his progeny, as if he held the views developed by his disciples. All too often, Schiller is classified as a romantic, as if there were no differences in principle between them. In the late 1790s, when Schiller had already laid down his philosophical pen, the young Novalis and Schlegel reacted against the foundationalist program that had once inspired Schiller. Unlike Schiller, they rejected the possibility of finding first principles, and they were skeptical of all definitions and infallible criteria. The purpose of poetry, in their view, is to transcend the limits of discursivity, to attain an intuition or insight into the wholeness and unity of things, which cannot be captured by the analytical intellect. We must be careful, however, not to read this later romantic doctrine back into Schiller. For all Schiller's influence on the Romantics, he was much more critical about the claims of poetry, much more skeptical about its pretensions to provide a kind of immediate knowledge inaccessible to philosophy. In his insistence on first principles and systematicity, Schiller shows himself to be still loyal to the legacy of the Aufklärung, which had always attempted to provide a solid foundation for the authority of reason. Now I'm going to skip a whole section here and just move on to the third. Schiller clashes with postmodernism on much more than matters of exposition style. He is at odds with the postmodernists regarding the very basics of aesthetics. This is evident from Schiller's project in the Kallias-Briefe to establish what he called a science of aesthetics. Schiller was convinced that it is possible to formulate what he called, quote, an objective principle of taste, a concept of beauty which could serve as the criterion to judge impartially all matters of taste. It was Schiller's mission to rebuild aesthetics on a new critical foundation, just as Kant had done for metaphysics in the first critique and for ethics in the second. Schiller modeled his project on the example of Kant. Yet ironically, it was Kant himself who had declared such a project to be impossible. In the third critique, Kant had steadfastly maintained that there cannot be a science of aesthetics, although he insisted that judgments of taste must be universalized. He doubted that there could be objective principles to assess. He likened the search for such principles to the quest for, quote, the philosopher's stone. Schiller, however, could not reconcile himself to Kant's skepticism, which he believed stemmed from his limited experience with thought. Schiller's quest for an objective aesthetic began from his dissatisfaction with Kant's account of aesthetic judgment in the Critique der Urteilskraft. Like many readers of Kant, Schiller had difficulty in squaring two aspects of Kant's analysis. One, his claim that aesthetic experience consists in only a feeling of pleasure, which, quote, designates nothing whatsoever in the object. And two, his insistence that aesthetic judgment demands universal assent. The first point seems to undermine the second. For if an aesthetic judgment concerns only the feelings of the perceiver, which refer to nothing at all of the object, it is impossible to provide any justification or reason. And it is then difficult, if not impossible, to secure agreement or universal assent. If one perceiver finds an object beautiful and another sees it as ugly, they can resolve their disagreements only by giving grounds for their judgments. And such grounds ultimately involve reference to some features of the object itself. It is necessary to identify, for example, the harmony of the design, the interplay of colors, the expressiveness of its lines, and so on. We need to know what makes the object beautiful. We cannot secure agreement simply by describing the feelings elicited by those objects. The point behind the criterion of beauty is then to determine the general nature of those objective features that make an object appear beautiful. We can reformulate the rationale behind Schiller's project along these lines. There must be some sufficient reason within the object itself to justify the claim that it, rather than an object with different or opposing characteristics, is the source of pleasure. If the pleasure were completely independent of the object, then two persons could have the same pleasure from completely different objects, or they could have completely different pleasures from the same object. But if this is the case, in what sense could judgments of taste be universalized? The universalizability of a setting judgment consists not simply in everyone liking a specific kind of experience, but also everyone taking pleasure in the same kind of object. Judgments of taste do not simply report feelings, but they also evaluate the merits and qualities of specific objects. The point behind the criterion of taste is to determine what these qualities have in common. Whatever its ultimate merits, Schiller's claim that there must be some perceptual features of the object itself to serve as the basis for aesthetic judgment articulates one of the central beliefs of classical aesthetics. We might formulate this belief as follows: that if A is an object of art, and art prime is not an object of art, then there must be some perceptual feature of A that A prime does not have. What does all this have to do with postmodernism, you might ask? Well, this belief of classical aesthetics, as defended by Schiller, runs counter to the fundamental principle of aesthetic postmodernism, as formulated by its high priest, Arthur Dante. The principle states, in Dante's hands, that of two perceptually identical objects, one can be an object, art, Warhol's Brillo box, and the other not be the Brillo box on the supermarket shelf. The problem with this principle, Schiller would say, is that it undermines all reason or justification of aesthetic judgment. For if an aesthetic judgment makes no reference to perceptual features of the objects, how could one justify? How could one expect others to feel the same? To appeal to the philosophy of the art world or its institutions, as Dante does, is only to take the judgment outside aesthetic experience altogether. Finally, I would like to challenge the postmodernist reading of Schiller on one final point. This concerns the interpretation of Schiller's culminating ideal at the close of his aesthetische Brief, the aesthetic state. The aesthetic state represents Schiller's utopia, his ideal of what society and the state should be when people realize their full humanity. The postmodernist criticism of this ideal has to be challenged because it is both popular and prevalent. Schiller's aesthetic state is comprehensible only through his contrast with two other types of state, the dynamic state and the ethical state. The dynamic state treats humans simply as physical beings who join society simply from self-interest or physical need. The ethical state regards humans as rational beings who enter society because there's a moral law to treat all human beings as ends in themselves. Only the aesthetic state regards humans as whole beings who are both rational and sensible, who act morally not only because it is rational, but also because it gives them pleasure. The citizens of the aesthetic state are the beautiful souls of Schiller's unmottled order, who have so internalized the moral law that they do their duty not against inclination, but from it. Pflicht aus Neigung is the German phrase. Schiller's concept of the aesthetic state has been charged with having irrationalist and totalitarian implications. This criticism was first made by Adorno, but it has been adopted by postmodernists, specifically Haldimand. The chief premise for this interpretation is that the chief premise for this interpretation is that it is the ideal of the aesthetic state. Schiller makes sentiment or feeling the basis of social bonds. The problem with making sentiment or feeling the basis of the state is that they can be manipulated and controlled by unscrupulous politicians. Hence, Schiller's aesthetic state can justify or ultimately lead to the fascist. Such criticism is unfounded, and for two basic reasons. First, it commits the common mistake of interpreting Schiller's sentiments and feelings as natural and pathological, rather than acquired and practical. It fails to see, in other words, that the sentiments of Schiller's beautiful soul, the citizen of the aesthetic state, arise from internalizing and habitualizing moral laws, whose ultimate basis lies in reason. It is important to see that Schiller thinks that affection or sentiment should not replace, but support reason as the foundation of the state. Second, it confuses the reason or justification of the laws with the impulse or incentive for executing. Schiller made this distinction in letter 8 of the Aesthetische Briefe when he declared that reason is necessary to discover and establish, while feeling is necessary to execute. We confuse this distinction, however, if we assume wrong that Schiller holds feeling to be a sufficient justification for the law. In sum, I can only regard the encounter of Schiller's scholarship with postmodernism as unfortunate. It has been fine insofar as postmodernism claims only to understand Schiller's place in the rhetorical tradition. But insofar as it tries to supersede a philosophical understanding of his writings, it goes beyond its limits. But it seems that the fortunes of postmodernism are now receding, and that the passion for it has waned. This is very fortunate, for we can now approach Schiller anew and with fresh eyes, without the fear of being out of fashion. That's what I had. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you to Professor Preiser. If we have any question, just raise your hand and I will give you the microphone. So while you are probably thinking about the question, I wanted to say something or maybe comment on your talk because of course there is this constant debate about whether Schiller is a philosopher. I mentioned it earlier, Kuno Fischer book, Schiller as Philosopher, that you reprise for your own book, which is titled Schiller is a Philosopher. But we also know that like philosophy is this undefined effort, because I think there are no other science or disciplines that have so much book that are titled "What is Philosophy?" So it's like, and for example, even the last book, "What is Philosophy?" begins by saying that at a certain time, every philosopher started to wonder what is that I'm doing, and so it's like among the reasons that you mentioned for why Schiller is a philosopher, for example, his formation or his reading of Kant and wanting to continue Kant's philosophy. There is, I think, also this idea of self-reflection that comes from his poetic activity. So it's like he starts to wonder what is that I'm doing as a poet, as an artist, and this leads him to philosophy. So like philosophers started to wonder what is that I'm doing, and he's a philosopher in asking what is that I'm doing as a poet. I don't know what you think about it.
Yeah, are you saying that it's unclear what a philosopher is? So then, if that's the case, what are you after in defining Schiller as a philosopher? And I think philosophy is a kind of natural art. Some people might disagree with this, but I go back to Plato and the quarrel between philosophy and poetry in the Republic. And you'll remember that Socrates tells people, well, go and talk to those poets. I have a quarrel. And the quarrel is about philosophy is a discursive discipline. It asks for the reasons for beliefs, and it asks that we give reasons for them and assesses them. And that's what I regard as definitive of philosophy. And that I regard as, in a way, very different from poetry, because I don't think poets are very much concerned with the reasons for their beliefs and whether they're cogent or not. So I think Schiller, when he was doing philosophy, was very much in this Platonic tradition of trying to examine the reasons for beliefs and whether they were good reasons. And that's really behind his objective aesthetic, where he's saying we have to give an aestheticism, we have to give reasons for them. And that's not really so much a poet's concern. And so I think there's a real, in that very basic sense, we can call Schiller a philosopher. And I think it's sufficient to distinguish him as being a poet, because there's a poet who's not concerned with the philosophical reasons for beliefs. There was the section of the paper I omitted, who actually concerned this issue of philosophical style versus literary style. And the literary style wasn't, according to Schiller's own account, is not concerned with the reasons for beliefs, but philosophy. The philosophical style was. So that's sort of the basis of my making this distinction between philosophy and poetry. It presupposes a very old distinction. Philosophy is a discursive discipline concerned with reasons for beliefs. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. Yes, a bit for question. I fully agree with you there. He postponed an appropriation or fish for sugar is raw about fashion. And you can go by couple them around to lean outdated and smart for sugar. And I wondered whether is it really plausible to give him the belief by person that is reading on cult aesthetics spark memory. So when that was said about having the same pleasure at different publics, because going communities, this kind of be, we don't to say, gang van de society and sex. So therefore, I would say, if you don't care about significance of sugar today, would it not give that also that post-colonialism is British out? Would it not be reviewing the discussion on sugar? And then find out who say comes up with a perspective position. So in my art is that this equation will not done if question and it's presented that way you. Does don't do justice to this step. If we did this step,
Oh, I don't.
all the colors it is, it knows gone. Some shit in squeak. So not that all real have the same version, but they give us, we say, expect on the other book, and then it's all their senses removed that's from concept. So again, it's a burial description of very enemy side values to pick as we smart. I'm not sure this start this called these bird as a able put on the brown old one I should consider.
So I'm not sure how we're disagreeing. I mean, so Kant says quite clearly that we can't give an objective basis for the judgment of text because the aesthetic judgment, as he says, bezieht sich nicht auf einem object, doesn't refer to an object whatsoever. And that, I think, is really the source of, of Schiller's disagreement. I mean, how can you possibly resolve an aesthetic dispute without referring to aspects or features of the object itself? That was Schiller's puzzle. That's in the Kalias Bullshit. And I have the same problem. I just don't know how you can resolve it. You have to refer to the features, but then if you're doing that, that's really not so Kantian. You can't refer to what's going on in your head. So I might be wrong with Kant's reading of aesthetic judgments. In fact, I think I would regard that as a virtue than anything else, but I'm not Kantian at all in these things. But anyway, I don't know what to say about that. I mean, how can Kant say the judgments of the taste are objective?
Yeah, so I think that will be the issue to discuss before Jordan Darwin updated is of Schiller. That was my only point. So there should be so we review this discussion again, given that also the appropriations, unfortunately.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. I was being there in the paper a bit. I should say I was being a bit contentious. Yeah, I was identifying with Schiller, but also agreeing with it. But I think I think my disagreement with Kant is Schillerian, because in the Federico's brief, he talks about the need to make these judgments object. And that's about referring to features of the object itself. Yeah, you're right. I mean, we can go on about aesthetics much longer.
Professor Artemo?
Yeah, I think we want to talk about. I perfectly agree with your rejection of a possible interpretation. So, but at what point? So, but I had an idea. So, as you said, Schiller's concept of the steady state has a sense for the process of institutionalization. So he knows that an individual must be integrated in an institutional framework. By the way, of education. In another sense of, in German language, that's CEO and builder. Yeah. So, is this a thing in neo-Kantian context? The same concept, possibly on the aesthetic stage was Wendelband and Fischer and so on. They are all talking about this. And this the formula of the 19th century is education by science. This, Eastern Cohen's concept and so education by science. So is this a state as an aesthetic institution, or is it more the university? So this our institution be the institution which allows us to have to live to build up an aesthetic form, aesthetic life form. Yeah. Also said, also to mean about what do you think?
So you're saying, to what does he ascribe? The question is how you would get to the aesthetic stage inside this aesthetic state.
Yeah, what is it? When they say around I'm not more the aesthetic concept of pleasure and science, so what's the state?
Yeah. So that raises an important issue about how you would become a formal aesthetic character in the aesthetic stuff. And you do that with autonomous institutions of education, or does the state itself provide that? Yeah. And I don't know if Schiller actually addresses that issue. So I think it's an important one, but I don't know how he does. I think he doesn't want the state itself to do it. I think he's assuming that there's some kind of autonomous aesthetic institutions, educational institutions that are going to do it. He's very, very, that's a big area he doesn't really talk about. Yeah, I don't know how that flummoxes me, that question, and I don't know how Schiller would answer it. But I think he presupposes that the educating institutions are going to be independent of the state. If they weren't, then you'd be back to all kinds of problems. He's enough of an old-fashioned liberal to say that the state should have no role in these things. And while it should be, that is unclear to me. And so I haven't answered your question. George, that's a good one.
Okay, so thank you for your talk, and I will now give the floor. To Rudolf Mehr, who was a Marie Curie Fellow at the University of Siegen, and he is now the principal investigator of a project on Alois' real critical realism. And his research focuses on the history of philosophical ideas and particularly scientific philosophy between the 18th and the 19th century. And it is the author of the book Der transzendentale Grundsatz der Vernunft, and he also curated the new edition of Alois' real philosophical criticism and co-edited the collections Kant, Österreich, and Konzept der Einbildungskraft. So he was supposed to deliver his talk together with Stefan Klinger, who couldn't be here today, but I'm sure that you will rise up to the occasion. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So we prepared this text together, Stefan and I, and unfortunately he can't make it, so I want to present by myself and hope he can answer your questions afterwards. The title of our talk is The Beautiful Soul, Schiller's Rupture with Kant. The dispute between Friedrich Schiller and Immanuel Kant over the doctrine of the primacy of practical philosophy has become a classical controversy in the history of philosophy. It expands the tension between Enlightenment thought on the one hand and Romanticism on the other. In keeping with Schiller's self-understanding, the history of Kant's reception in the 19th century emphasized a continuity with Kant's practical philosophy. Schiller's critique was accordingly seen as directed only toward a psychological or anthropological limitation or supplementation of Kant's practical philosophy. Thank you. This interpretation was largely adopted uncritically in neo-Kantianism. There were, however, dissenting voices that pointed out Schiller's mislabeling and the problematic understanding of Kant. Bruno Fischer on the one hand and Bruno Bauch on the other clearly articulated Schiller's break with Kant, and in doing so consistently defined neo-Kantianism as a return to Kant and against Romanticism. Well, Stefan and I, we start our reflections with the premise that Schiller does not simply adopt Kant's conception of practical philosophy, but rather transforms and expands that. We want to call this the supplementation thesis. These expansions, however, can be considered a continuity only if Schiller remains committed to the fundamental principles of Kant's practical philosophy. A rupture, by contrast, arises when Schiller's extensions come in a fundamental conflict with Kant's project. So the starting point is the supplementation thesis. There are two perspectives on the supplementation thesis, the continuity perspective and the rupture thesis. The talk pursues two interrelated aims. First, starting from the charge of rigorism, it reconstructs Schiller's conception of the beautiful soul. Two theses emerge here. A, that Schiller's critique of Kant's opposition between duty and inclination does not go far enough, and B, that the revision built upon this critique calls into question the universal validity of the moral law itself. Second thesis. It can be argued that Fischer and Bauch had already identified and clearly articulated this rupture between Kant and Schiller in the 1850s and again in the early 1900s. Thus, through the entire period in which neo-Kantianism constituted the dominant academic current in the German-speaking world, there existed an awareness of the central differences between the two thinkers. You can't hear me? Is it better? Okay. So, first thesis, the reconstruction of Schiller and the problem with his charge of rigorism. Or the second thesis that there is a continuity, started from Fischer with to Bauch of the awareness, the central difference between the two thinkers. Fischer and Bauch not only broke with a romanticized interpretation of Kant's practical philosophy, but also anticipated findings that would not be demonstrated textually in Kant's scholarship until the 1990s in the context of the debate about the role of feeling in moral action. So, let me show the plan for my talk. The talk is organized in three parts. Beginning with the discussion of Schiller's reception in neo-Kantianism, it seeks to assign the different neo-Kantian positions to either the continuity or rupture thesis. This is part one. This is followed by a step-by-step reconstruction of Kant-Schiller debate, discussing similarities, differences, and central misunderstandings, especially in the light of Fischer's and Bauch's readings. Part two. This approach ultimately allows for a reassessment of Schiller's reception in neo-Kantianism against the background of Kant's teaching on the primacy of practical philosophy and Schiller's conception of the beautiful soul. So that's the plan. Let's get started with part one. The Kant-Schiller controversy in neo-Kantianism and beyond. The Kant-Schiller controversy is an important era of research within neo-Kantianism. Various authors at different times engaged with this controversy on the basis of their newly developed understanding of Kant. Until the second half of the 19th century, the continuity thesis dominated, along with the assumption that Schiller merely expanded Kant's teaching
on the primacy of practical philosophy. This standpoint is expressed in the 1870s by the most prominent representatives of neo-Kantianism, Hermann Cohen in Kants Begründung der Ästhetik and Wilhelm Windelband in Schiller und die Gegenwart both attribute to Schiller a fundamentally correct grasp of Kant's philosophical approach. For Windelband, Schiller is even a prophet of Kant's philosophy, while Cohen explicitly regards the concept of the beautiful soul as a supplement to Kant. Ernst Cassirer likewise arrives at similar conclusions, particularly in Idee und Gestalt, methodischer Idealismus, a text from 1921. He too emphasizes less the differences between Kant and Schiller than the significance of Schiller for post-Kantian romantic philosophy. The most detailed argument is presented by Karl Vollender in his essay Ethischer Rigorismus und sittliche Schönheit, where he defends the continuity from Kant to Schiller, particularly with regard to moral philosophy. These authors, and also Moritz Wilhelm Drobisch, Karl Grün, and Otto Liedtmann, these authors stand exemplarily for the continuity thesis in neo-Kantianism. The reflections of Kuno Fischer and Bruno Bauch, however, stand in contrast to this standpoint. Within the framework of neo-Kantianism, they stand out as the exception that proves the rule. In his Schiller book, Schiller als Philosoph, published in 1858, Fischer identifies a fundamental difference in the philosophical presuppositions of the two opponents. Fischer refers in particular to the conception of the human ideal. I want to give you a passage from his book. He writes, in a number of his most significant aphorisms, the beauty of the soul and the cultivation of the soul are praised as the highest measure of human perfection, as the true mark of human ideal, so that the aesthetic human being now appears not merely as the condition and precursor, but as the very fulfillment of the moral. The aesthetic human being is the unity of the sensuous and the rational, and the individual and the universal. Almost 50 years later, in his 1905 essay Schiller und die Idee der Freiheit, Bauch reaffirmed the rupture thesis already outlined by Fischer and further developed it systematically. He argues that because of an independent metaphysical fundamental view and a not insignificant misunderstanding of Kant's doctrine, Schiller distanced himself from Kant's conception of freedom. As he says, and you can find that again on the PowerPoint slide, it's the second quote, he deceived himself about Kant's teaching, and had he in fact stood in the relation to it in which he believed himself to stand, he would not merely have given himself the appearance of an opponent, but would have been an opponent. Well, Bauch and Fischer thus articulated a position that would appear in sharpened form only in the second half of the 20th century, and especially in the 1990s in the context of the debate about the role of feeling in moral action. In these debates, Schiller was identified as the first critic to accuse Kant of neglecting the role of feeling. Started from this so-called asceticism charge, the differing metaphysical presupposition of the two opponents were highlighted, and Kant's practical philosophy was clearly distinguished from Schiller's reflection. So I can't go into detail in this debate, just mention a couple of names, Henry Alesi, Robert Herrmann, Alan Wunsch, and these guys stand for this debate in the 1990s. with a few exceptions, and the most prominent and I guess the most important is Frederick Beiser. With a few exceptions, these analysis of the Kant-Schiller controversy proceeds without reference to neo-Kantianism. And I think it's a good point to have this conference here to deepen this gap in research and to talk about these differences. I want to do that in the second part, in conflict. Stefan and I think we should not look at rupture or continuity as if they could be determined based on a scale, where the similarities as a whole might outweigh the difference, but ask whether the undeniable differences, that's what we call the supplementation thesis, ask whether the undeniable differences undermine the assumed common ground of Kant's philosophy or not. In order to assess this, the similarities and difference must first be reconstructed, followed by an analysis of Schiller's misunderstandings. And that's the two section of part 2. I start with the similarities and difference. Schiller makes frequent use of Kant's terminology. He admits in a letter to Gottfried Körner that, and we can find out here again, I have already taken much from Kant and made it my own. In substance, he agrees with Kant's practical philosophy on two key points. First, that the principles of morality must be grounded in reason rather than the pursuit of happiness. And second, that an action has moral worth only when it is performed for the sake of duty. So there are a lot of quotes in Unmuten Abtext where you can find these 2 points. Schiller, however, rejects 2 aspects of Kant's practical philosophy. First, the strict separation of inclination and duty, and second, closely related to this, the imperative tone of Kant's ethics of duty. I want to give you an example. You can find it here. It's the second volume, the PowerPoint slide. In Kant's moral philosophy, the idea of duty is presented with such harshness that it frightens away all grace and might easily tempt a weaker mind to seek moral perfection along the path of the dark and monastic asceticism. Unquote. Schiller and Kant thus share a common foundation of ethical conviction, according to which morality entails obedience to reason. Beyond this shared foundation, both thinkers agree that human beings possess a dual nature, at once sensible and rational, but they differ fundamentally in how they interpret the relationship between sensibility and reason. Here are 2 quotes. I don't want to read through these quotes from Fischer and Bauer, just to give you the textual evidence of our reflections, where these 2 philosophers, neo-Kantian philosophers, have highlighted this point. Generally speaking, the tension between sensibility and reason can be conceived in 3 ways: as the subordination of one side to the other, so sensibility above reason or reason above sensibility, or as a form of balance. Both Kant and Schiller, however, agree that if sensibility were to be placed above reason, it could not lead to morality. That is the first form of subordination. According to Schiller's interpretation, however, according to Schiller's interpretation, moral values in Kant stand in opposite to inclination. From Schiller's perspective, while Kant argues for a pure morality in which reason is placed above sensibility, this is the second form of subordination, Schiller calls instead for a unity of duty and inclination, advancing the concept of the beautiful soul or of moral beauty. So we have this opposition between pure morality and beautiful soul and moral beauty. But these are Schiller's words, of course. Inclination, Schiller argues, can indeed contribute to moral value alongside duty. Only the complete harmony of both principles, as Baut reconstructs Schiller's position, indeed their unity, constitutes the perfection, the perfect seal of humanity and what is meant by a beautiful soul. In contrast to Kant's rigorism, Schiller insists that it is only through the interplay of inclination and duty, in the form of a duty performed out of inclination, that a genuinely moral disposition can arrive. This alone makes the true moral perfection of human beings possible. With an ease, as he writes, with an ease as if instinct alone were acting, the beautiful soul performs humanity's most difficult duties. Put it differently, for Schiller, the beautiful soul represents a kind of pre-established harmony between inclination and practical reason, through which one fulfills duties instinctively. Consistently with this, Schiller also rejects the imperative form of the moral law, when the moral law always addresses human beings in the form of a command. It produces an ethics for slaves, one that works through fear rather than through trust. There is that no moral surpassing of duty, but there is an aesthetic one, and this becomes an anthropological principle. Fischer formulates Schiller's ideal as follows. In the aesthetic disposition of mind, our powers are in balance and harmony. Here we find ourselves in a state of calm reflection and refined desire. The enemy over which moral strength is meant to triumph is reconciled and has disappeared. Such triumphs are no longer necessary. In this sense, Bauch also puts it, quoting Schiller, and this is the second quote on the PowerPoint slide, just as metaphysics is directed toward the convergence of reason and nature, so ethics is directed toward the attunement of morality and sensibility, of duty and inclination. Worldview and view of life are oriented toward one another and proceed in complete parallel through the striving for a reconciled unification of the position. This parallelism makes the imperative form of the categorical imperative unnecessary. Well, these are similarities and differences between Schiller and Kant in the light of Bauch and Fischer. What we want to do now is to talk about Schiller's misunderstandings and to strengthen our ruptured thesis. Schiller attributes to Kant presuppositions which he then criticizes in order to make his own expansions and supplementation appear plausible. However, these supplementations also contradict Kant's actual presupposition. When interpreting Schiller, it is therefore important to distinguish between self-fashioned similarities and differences and the real ones. At least 3 fundamental misunderstandings can be reconstructed that account for Schiller's supplementation. The first one. Schiller's critique of Kant begins with the rigid separation of inclination and duty. This charge of rigorism, however, rests on a misunderstanding of Kant. Bauch points this out explicitly when he writes, the charge of rigidity Schiller raised against Kant is based on a misunderstanding. For Kant, duty without regard to inclination does not mean that it is always directed against inclination. That an action is in fact performed from duty is shown precisely in those cases where there is no inclination to perform it. Kant makes this clear already in the groundwork of the metaphysics of moral, in his exposition of the concept of duty. For example, when he discusses the duty of self-preservation. So this is apart from the groundwork. I don't want to read through this long quote, but it is important to highlight that for Kant, on the basis of justifying moral laws, there is no contradiction between duty and inclination. On a second level, there might be a contradiction, but even there must not be a contradiction. Kant only highlights, and that's why I want to show this quote, that it is easier for us to recognize if somebody acts based on duty, if he's doing that against inclination. But it is just an epistemological principle, and it's not a Kantian project for justifying moral principles. There can then indeed be agreement between duty and inclination. Kant's central point, however, is that inclination must not be the determining ground of the will. He writes, now, an action from duty is to put aside entirely the influence of inclination, and with it every body of every object of the will. Hence, there is left for the will nothing that should determine it except objectively the law and subjectively pure respect for this practical law. And so the maxim of complying with such a law, even if it infringes upon all my inclinations. Kant therefore asks about the condition that the will must meet in order to be good. An action is in accordance with duty if it follows the categorical imperative, the criterion of universal validity. At the center of Kant's ethics stands morality, not the mere legality of action. An action is good because it is commanded by practical reason and performed out of respect for the moral law. In Religion Within the Boundaries of Mere Reason, he formulates this in his reply to Schiller's Über Anmut und Würde as follows. I want to read through this famous footnote for the Schiller-Kant controversy. I readily grant that I am unable to associate gracefulness with the concept of duty, by reason of its very dignity. For the concept of duty includes unconditional necessitation, to which gracefulness stands in direct contradiction. The majesty of the law, like the law on Sinai, installs awe, not dread, which repels, and also not fascination, which invites familiarity. And this awe rouses the respect of the subject toward his master. Expect that in this case, since the master lies in us, it rouses a feeling of sublimity of our own vocation that enraptures us more than any beauty. End of quotation. Schiller's concept of the beautiful soul would therefore for Kant amount to moral enthusiasm. We call that in German Schwärmerei. And if we look in Kant's critique of practical philosophy, we find that this uses a technical term for Kant's philosophy. You can find that here on the quote. From Kant's perspective, Schiller transgresses the limits of human reason by introducing principles constructed for the very purpose and thus falls into enthusiasm. This is, moreover, moral enthusiasm, since he seeks motives for moral action beyond respect for the law itself. Bauhaus marks clear in this connection that Schiller fails to grasp the significance of this logical distinction between inclination and duty. And he writes, he overlooks the nature of the opposition. In misunderstanding this distinction, Schiller confuses what Kant demonstrated to be extramoral with what is immoral. So inclination is extra-moral if we talk about Kant's practical philosophy. The divergent interpretations of the relation between sensibility and reason within the human being's sensible, rational, dual nature thus rest on a fundamentally different conception of human nature and human vocations in Kant and Schiller. Kant's critical perspective, in this sense, becomes a causal metaphysical wall in Schiller's hand. Well, second misunderstanding. Schiller interprets Kant's pure morality as the ethos of fulfilling duty for the sake of duty. He accordingly interprets Kant's project as a autonomous ethics of law and in doing so misconstrues it entirely. According to Kant, then there is no unity of duty and inclination, but there is indeed a synthesis, so much so that he can write that a heart joyous in the compliance with its duty, not just compliance in the recognition of it, is the sign of a genuine and virtuous disposition. Beyond these historical connections, it becomes clear that Schiller's critique of pure morality is directed less against Kant than against himself. And in this way, he overcomes a pietist's inheritance in his own thought. This is especially evident in the terms that Schiller himself introduces into the debate. Servants, the children of the house, fear, trust, tree, fruits of the tree, and so on. None of these terms come from Kant's philosophy. They are taken from Luther's Bible and revolve around the themes such as the law of the gospel and the law of grace. Especially Baut exposes this self-critique, disguised as a critique of Kant through several stages of Schiller's reflection on freedom. But misunderstanding. Kant and Schiller's differing interpretations of the human being's sensible, rational, dual nature also lead to theoretical differences concerning the faculties. In Kant, free will and the law of practical reason stand in relation to mutual determination. So this is a long quote from the Critique of Practical Reason, which I don't want to read through, just to give you text evidence. In Schiller, by contrast, the will as the principle of human self-determination is independent of its relation to practical reason. According to Bauer, it was Kant's idea of the intellectus archetypus that provided the poet with an initial favorable point of reference, whereas the greatest critical thinker sought precise and logically conceptual distinction. The poet aimed at a real unification and synthesis. And the process, Kant's determining power of judgment quietly becomes for him a determining reason and critical ideality to value reality the value reality turned into metaphysical reality. Free will thus becomes an exalted principle standing between the demand of reason and the trials. If the will, in Schiller's sense, is assigned an unconditional value, then practical reason becomes merely a faculty for issuing moral prescriptions. And it is precisely this point that Schiller leaves as a charge against Kant, without taking into account the shifted presuppositions in their respective conception. In contrast to Kant's ethic of duty, Schiller posits a free-floating will that follows the maxim, determine yourself, run yourself. Well, let me conclude in part 3, super short. best friends almost. All three of the misunderstandings reconstructed in the previous section rest on Schiller's fundamental shifting of Kant's principles. In this sense, they do not touch Kant's actual project, so it does not really make sense to talk about continuity here. Schiller's supplementations are not opposed to Kant. The conflict arises instead from Schiller's metaphysical shift of the critical project on which he bases his supplementation. Let me broaden the picture a bit. From a historical perspective, Schiller's self-understanding of his connection to Kant's project had the consequence that criticism was transformed into subjective idealism without acknowledging the transformation as such. The quantitative expansion, he claimed, thus proves to be a fundamental revision of the foundations of Kant's project. This revision significantly contributed to a shift in transcendental philosophy that was carried out through Truman idealism and whose reversal was the central task of neo-Kantianism. Yet, neo-Kantianism, apart from the exceptions of Fischer and Bauer discussed here, struggled to enforce its return to Kant with the framework of the doctrine of the primacy of practical philosophy. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Rudolf, for your very rich talk. If we already have some questions, okay. So, Federico, can you speak loud, or should I come with the mic? Okay, please.
I think I understood the say a little bit on your comments way earlier in the conclusion, because it's something I'm interested in just to evolve that, or why is that, in the case of Olive Potato, what was it stated for him in breaking with a plan of neo-Kantian working off to have that completely not show up? Why got the narrative to disobey any further involved on that?
Yeah. There are lots of reasons why Bauer talks about Schiller at this 1904 essay. There are a lot of political reasons and all these things. I have skipped all these things, so I'm not interested in this dimension. But Bauer, he's a philosopher who really can read the Kantian text. And if we have the Kantian text base and the Schiller text in front of you, you can see that there are a lot of misunderstandings which lead to the problematic interpretations and lead to the supplementations. And Bauer is super clear in these points. And he listed all these texts from Schiller and showed how he struggled with his own pietist inherence and all these things, and showed that the Kantian project is completely different than the Schiller project. And so Fischer isn't so clear than Bauer is, of course, but Bauer is really clear, and he's really mentioning the background of Schiller is currently different than the background of Kant. But yeah, I don't have an idea. So he likes Schiller, of course. Schiller is important for Germany and all these things. But he's particularly in his Kant interpretation, Schiller's Kant interpretation. And yeah, I don't know what are other reasons why he's highlighting that. But of course, he has the power to read the Kantian text and to understand Kant's practical philosophy, and he really sees the difference between Schiller and Kant.
Is he clear about which words means he disagrees with most of it?
I think he doesn't say something about that. He doesn't say, so this is wrong interpretation, this is wrong. So he's really formulating a analysis of Schiller and bringing it into contact and making the Kantian context. But he's not saying this is the wrong interpretation. This is wrong. And this is why I want to do that. So this is also the reason why I don't have a good answer for your question. But yeah.
Okay, Professor Hartung. I don't know. You will raise your hand almost simultaneously. I don't know. Okay, or this will come.
Sort of the point of view be like this is three dimensions, so Schiller really Kant, the neo-Kantians like reading Schiller and Kant, and now we are here in this wonderful city and talking about that Schiller and Kant. So I vision this Schiller's rupture with Kant. This is not the point in the time around 18 Naples. And I think it's not the point around deeply the neo-Kantians, because the neo-Kantians, as far as I know them, are reading Schiller very close to Kant. Whereas the Indus reading is that Kant is very close to Fichte. So national awakening is very important around national or nationalistic point. So this is one of Umlaw is very important as a Protestant. So we do this a Protestant principle. So can never say this, and can never would say something about national point of view. So this or Fichte. Yeah, and so Fichte is very close to Schiller. There it was. So where's the Ramschaft?
Yeah, good question. You're directly going into the heart of our work, because we started our debate on the Schiller-Kant controversy not with neo-Kantianism. So we discussed the Schiller-Kant debate, and Stefan and I, and we find systematic points and arguments to strengthen the rupture thesis. And then we checked, because we are invited to this wonderful conference, the neo-Kantian authors. And we saw that none of them really understood what is going on in the Schiller-Kant debate. So I listed a couple of these authors, expect Bach and Fischer, and then we read the Bach-Fischer texts, and we gave our own systematic position, historical background in neo-Kantianism. And for this reason, it's quite important and good to really be clear about these three dimensions, the historical dimension, the Kant-Schiller debate, the neo-Kantian reception, and our systematic point of view. So that's completely right. And we mixed that a bit, or I've mixed that a bit in my talk, but I think we are clear about this point of the paper, and we want to be clear about these points in the paper to yeah.
Very good. Yes, I also made I will do this very about what is thinking that bound out what you it's very probably agree with you that what about these secrets of sugar. Also would it feel you could have Bob was a great score on the investment on the family with this book of grammar that one of the best books of availability. So I have no doubt with it. But I think there is work of very important step that other folks on my old talk about national feasibility to what it will and now it's nothing. A baby carissima screaming a bought up a boy of continue we go sharing about. So and this is to why not just like you need one then on the things you very sure different right so at least the say thing or the criticizing cuts but the also for say German and I will put the inside of the large gets into the brain. So the one-sided and moral interpretation view could be this is what Schiller has seen as a global done. Now, and now you inside, oh, why is this big on and where's the possibility? But this is exactly the point in which Barth himself will just fall concentrics. So Barth fully reaches this. Fully reason this is at the deepest point of interpretation of Schiller and his debate on me away to one side. Well, I take it, but what's maybe you from now, but okay, but this whole why some say the most fundamental issue of ethics is not good enough. It's not encompassed enough. It's too narrow, focusing on will. And this is exactly what Schiller has seen. This is exactly where I, Bob, and now doing in trying to improve real ethics. I mean, I would say this is very extreme or really, but others who already agreed it is enough. But this, of course, they sort of say, a bit in contrast to this whole algebra, this book, it helped me misunderstand. But I said it's very well, no way. He said, although like you talk very much like the people, but the thing is this, you know, keep all the continuity of this.
Yeah, you're right. So I think it's indeed a problematic thing in general to say continuity, rupture thesis, and then having this strict separation and so on. But we thought that in the Kant-Schiller debate in scholarship, in the scholarship today, there is at least a bit missing the clear points about Schiller and Kant, and especially in this regard. So, what is Kant really what Kant really wants to do, or what is Kant really arguing in the Critique of Practical Reason, and why is this not a problem with the duty and inclination separation as Schiller with that? So this is an old debate, of course, of the 90s and old times, but it is important to highlight these points. Maybe you are right that there are a lot of more continuities than we highlight in our paper, but if we can clarify these points, that would be fine so far. And that's an aim, and I think that's important to be clear about these different philosophical conceptions, because as I mentioned in the last part of my conclusion, there is a rupture not only between Kant and Schiller, there's also a rupture in the philosophical tradition, post-Kantian philosophy, coming from Kant's project to romanticism, to German idealism, to all these philosophers starting from Kant, but formulating a completely different philosophical project. And Schiller is one of these guys connecting these two projects. But yeah, he's using the Kantian things, the Kantian words. He's saying, I'm a Kantian. And then it is problematic to understand these different approaches, right? See the relations and the differences, similarities and differences between these approaches. And we thought it could be worth to see what is going on in this debate to highlight also this difference.
So, if there are other questions, I would quickly want to ask you something. So, since there is, of course, this close connection between Schiller's misunderstandings of Kant and his criticism of Kant's philosophy, my question is, what Fischer, Bauch, or you think what comes first, the misunderstanding or the criticism? Because it's very different if Schiller wanted to follow on Kant's path, but maybe because he wasn't a philosopher by training, misunderstood some points and then thought it was necessary to criticize that. Or if Schiller wanted to criticize Kant and then to use a strong term, constructed a sort of straw man out of Kant's practical philosophy to better make his point.
Okay. Yeah, interesting question. I don't know if I have an answer. From my point of view, I would say the misunderstandings and then all supplementations and all these things. So, because otherwise the supplementation, you can't reconstruct the supplementations if you not see the misunderstandings. So, from this point of view, I would say this is the direction goes, but I'm not sure. Perhaps it is as you say in your second question.
Okay, so thank you, and thanks to do this. We had the coffee break waiting for us outside.